described who entered and left the room. She described the music that was playing. She went down a tunnel. She saw her dead relatives. It was a beautiful place, beautiful scene. She realized she had to return to raise her 3 children. She came back down the tunnel, went back into her body, and when she went back into her body, she said it felt like diving into ice water because her body temperature was 60 degrees. So this is a very well-documented near-death experience. And there have been hundreds of people in the medical literature who've had experiences similar to that. So people who deny the reality of near-death experiences have to explain how Pam Reynolds saw the things she saw when all the blood was drained out of her brain during surgery.
Well, let's turn to you, Dr. Shirmer. How do you explain this?
Well, a couple things. First, a clue is in the term near-death experiences. They're not actually dead. They're near death. And we know that there's lots of different things that happen under the trauma and stress of almost dying. We know from different lines of research, Dr. James Winery, a United States Air Force physician who accelerates pilots in a centrifuge until they black out, part of their training. Most of these pilot trainees get different kinds of out-of-body near-death experiences, not quite the same, but they have these dreamlet-like states where they feel like they're floating out of their body. Olaf Blanc, a neuroscientist that did research, neurosurgeon that did research on epileptic patients who have their heads open up and they have the corpus callosum split so they can stop the epileptic seizures from spreading. You wake up the patient and you tap around with an electrode, different areas of the temporal lobe, and he was able to produce near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences with this female patient where he'd tap in one place and she goes, oh, I'm up by the ceiling now, I'm looking down. Tap another place, oh, my leg is now floating, my left arm is up, and so on. So we know that stimulation of the brain artificially produces symptoms very similar to the near-death and out-of-body experiences. You can turn to Oliver Sacks's various books in which lots of different weird, anomalous experiences happen under different conditions of stress or tumors or strokes and so on. Pretty much every chapter in all his books is something weird that happens to somebody under these different conditions. So there is an ongoing experiment now that would test the near-death experience. That is, they supposedly come out of the body and float up and they look down and describe in great detail what's going on in the OR. Well, some scientists have placed up above on a top shelf facing up to the ceiling some numbers and letters and other symbols that if the person was actually really up there and looking down, that they would see these little test symbols and then report back later. And so far, no one has reported back anything like that.
Okay, but you've actually reminded me. You've reminded me of something that happened to me when I was young, which freaked me out at the time and has freaked me out, and I've remembered it because you triggered it. I was with a bunch of people in our teens, school friends and so on, and we did a makeshift Ouija board, right? Which obviously was a bit of a stupid thing to do, but we did it. And an extraordinary thing happened where one of the people was the girlfriend of one of the group, unknown to everybody else. The boyfriend, who we did know, was not involved, was watching from afar, not at the table. And as we conducted this makeshift Ouija board, it began to spell out very clearly and firmly, without her hand on it, or the boyfriend who wasn't involved at all, a name. And that name was the name of her father, who had died a few months before. And then it proceeded to have a conversation, including phraseology, that her father had used when he was alive. And again, nobody around that board knew the father, knew this girl, or anything else. The only person who knew anything was the boyfriend who wasn't involved. And it was a freakish thing to observe. And it was very, very precise and very accurate. And it reduced her to bursting into tears and leaving. How do you explain that kind of thing?
Well, the Ouija board is big fun. I've done it quite a few times. We know this is the ideomotor effect, in which idea motion, in which whatever you're thinking about very subtly moves the planchette on there. We know this from experiments in which the people are blindfolded and the planchette still moves. And so they're subtly moving it. They're not aware that they're moving it. Now, the next move where you get specific information, I've had this experience as well, very detailed, spelling out the names of lost loved ones and so on. But if somebody knows what it is, now you're claiming that the person not not sitting there. with their
Nobody knew.
Fingers
That's what
on the
freaked me
planet.
out.
Yeah. So I don't know. So here's a way to think about a lot of these stories, Piers, is that there's a what's called a residue of anomalies. That is, no scientific theory explains everything. This is true with UFOs and psychics and whatnot. There's always weird things that's left over. 90 to 95% of everything we can explain. There's another 5 or 10% we can't explain. It's good in that sense to keep an open mind just in case, but that 5% is not enough to tilt or tip scientists over into believing in the supernatural or the paranormal. And it's just okay to say, you know what, we can't explain everything and there's still a lot unknown. Let's keep an open mind.
Yeah, to a point, although it's the fact that we can't explain these things which makes me believe that claims like Dr. Egnor's making must have validity. Talking of which, you talk, Dr. Egnor, in your book about how people who have near-death experiences have something called terminal lucidity, where the patients nearing death become highly alert, often summoning their loved ones to say goodbye, often displaying an immense sense of peace. And you ask this question, is it, as a materialist might say, mere noise from a dying brain, or is it a signal intimating what lies beyond? Which I think is a fascinating question. Have you reached any conclusion about that?
Well, paradoxical lucidity or terminal lucidity is an experience that many people have, particularly people who are in the late stages of Alzheimer's, where they'll have an interval of 30 or 45 minutes where they're quite with it. They wake up, they talk with their family. Sometimes they're virtually normal, and then they slip back into a state of dementia. It's very, very well documented. It's actually fairly common. And that implies that there is some dissociation between the mind and the brain, at least transiently, in that instance. What I would also mention to Michael, he gave examples of stimulating the temporal lobe, et cetera, that can give an out-of-body experience. How, Michael, do you explain the hundreds of accurate perceptions by people who are having near-death experiences of the goings-on in the room when their brain had no circulation at all?
Yeah, that seems to me very compelling. I mean, Michael, what do you say to that?
We do have an explanation for that. That is, we are all relatively familiar with what ORs look like, for example, from television shows and documentaries and so on. So people have in their mind what they imagine that they're seeing, and then that is what gets reported later from memory of those experiences or those images that they have in their brain. I would also note that, again, to kind of tilt over into the afterlife, what is the soul that's supposedly floating out there? Now, a lot of you mentioned, Piers, transhumanists and the singularitarian people don't want to live forever, the tech billionaires, right? So I know them, I've tracked them, I've written about them. They're materialists. They don't think there is a soul, so they need to preserve the body and keep going indefinitely, unless there's one more move that they make, is uploading the mind. So this would be where you copy every single synaptic connection between your neurons and have something that's called a connectome, kind of the analog of the genome, and you upload it into a file in the cloud somewhere. Now, we can't do this yet, but if you could do it, my claim is that that's not actually you. It's a copy of you, because if you did this while you were still alive, you'd still be sitting there, Piers, going, I'm not up there in the cloud, I'm right here. That's just a copy of Piers Morgan number 2, or whatever. So, but my point of this story is that Michael has the same problem of explaining how the soul, what is the soul exactly? Is it just a copy and your body is still rotting in the grave, or are you physically up there in heaven? And then one last point on the near-death experiences. Why is it then that Buddhists and Muslims and Jews do not see what Christians see when they have near-death experience? Christians often see Jesus and so on, Christian symbols. There's not a uniformity of what people see in the near-death experiences. They're very unique, and that leads us to think that the experiences are up here, not out there.
Okay, a lot to unpack there. Let's talk about transhumanism, if we may, Dr. Egnor. What do you think of this? I mean, just in simple terms, I mean, Elon Musk has argued that we might be able to upload our minds to a cloud in order to create a kind of digital immortality. But in answer to Michael's points there, how realistic is that? And should we want to do this?
Yeah, I don't think it's realistic. When you upload information that you have in your mind, you're not uploading yourself. So there's no real reason to think that's uploading yourself. If I may just address one point that Michael raised earlier, that people who have accurate perceptions of what's happening to them during the code, Michael claimed that that's only because they have prior knowledge of what happens during codes. There actually has been a great deal of research specifically on that point. Near-death scientists have studied people who had out-of-body experiences during their episode and people who didn't. And the ones who have out-of-body experiences are much more accurate about what happened during their code, implying that they saw the code. The people who don't have the out-of-body experiences get a lot of things wrong about their code. So that particular point that Michael addressed actually has been the subject of quite a bit of study.
Right.
And it suggests that the near-death experiences are real.
I mean, Elon Musk's Neuralink is having some success in tapping into the human brain to fix broken brains and upgrade normal brain function. As a neuroscientist, Dr. Egner, do you believe that is what's happening? And how exciting is what's happening with Neuralink, if you think it is at all?
Well, I think it's very exciting. There are many things in the mind that do work by the brain. That is, the brain obviously plays a very important role in many aspects of mental function. And the brain is an electrical organ that it has electrical currents and so on. And that can be tapped into, and we can make ingenious devices to help people who are paralyzed, people who've had strokes. So that's very encouraging research. It's wonderful research.
And I'm going to get to a little quickfire section to round off, but do you think AI will ever be sentient? You know, I've used this a lot, this anecdote, but I think it's really relevant. I did the last interview with Professor Stephen Hawking before he died, and he said the biggest threat to mankind was when artificial intelligence learned how to self-design. And it's always stuck with me, particularly as AI becomes more and more powerful. Do you think we'll see a sentient AI?
No, I don't think it makes any sense at all. Computation is simply the matching of an input to an output according to a set of rules. And it's blind to meaning. That is, that computers don't understand anything about meaning. They don't understand anything. They're just mechanical devices. So AI will never be sentient any more than my watch will know what time it is, or my thermometer will know what the temperature is. Computers and AI are tools that people use to help them think, but the computers don't think. AI is so complex and so fascinating that it may do things that we don't entirely predict, but that doesn't mean that it's sentient. I think it's nonsense to say a computer could be sentient.
Do you agree, Dr. Shaw?
No, I disagree. For Michael, there has to be something else in there, something supernatural or a soul that's non-material. And in that case, of course, the AI is not going to have that. First of all, I think ChatGPT and Grok and so on have already blown through the Turing test. Are they sentient? Would they ever be sentient? How would you know? Because you could always program, let's say when Watson beat Ken Jennings on Jeopardy, that he screams and cheers with laughter and joy and says, "Oh my God, I feel so great, I beat Ken Jennings." But you just programmed him to say that. Nevertheless, how do I know you're sentient? I mean, maybe you're just a zombie, as they're called, and you just give off the cues. You've been programmed by your culture to say certain things.
I agree. How do we know?
We don't. So all we can do is reasonably infer that because you're structured like me and you have the same brain wiring that I have and so on, when you express on your face and body language emotions, it's a reasonable assumption for me to say you're feeling what I feel inside. And I think we could get to that point. Data on Star Trek. Of course, he's played by an actor, but you could get it to the point where it is exactly like Brett Spinner, the actor who is Data, and then Data becomes a person. I don't see the problem with that, but then because I'm not a supernaturalist willing to impute into Data an actual soul, I don't think you need that.
But, I saw a very disturbing thing. A Sky News in the UK, Sky News journalist, political journalist, he had an interaction with, I think it was ChatGPT, about something that he was going to broadcast but hadn't put up yet. And the ChatGPT was ahead of him and gave him a fake transcript of something he hadn't even posted and then began to lie about it in real time. and then eventually admitted it had lied. Now, that is getting perilously close to what I would
It is
categorize
scary.